Good evening, I'm Barry Judge.
And I'm Jim Sackett. This is a special edition of Action 5 News.
1 year ago today, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, killing the 7 astronauts aboard. Tonight, we will take you to the Kennedy Space Center as people there pause for a moment of silence today in remembrance.
Plus an interview with astronauts about the future of America's space program.
But first tonight, families of the Challenger astronauts gathered today for a solemn tribute outside Washington, D.C. Family members traveled to the nation's capital to join NASA Administrator James Fletcher and other top agency officials in a brief service at the Army Chapel near Arlington National Cemetery. Killed in NASA's worst disaster were Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judy Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. The co-workers of the astronauts took time too today to remember their friends.
Barry, flags at the Kennedy Space Center were lowered to half staff and somber employees observed 73 seconds of silence. Joining us live now with Usenet 5 from the Kennedy Space Center is Deborah Gianolis with more on today's memorials.
Yes, Jim, as you said, it was 1 year ago today that America was in shock and mourning. You'll have to excuse me, I have a mosquito on my eye. In shock and mourning over the loss of the Challenger and the 7-member crew. Today at Cape Kennedy and in the surrounding communities, there were remembrances. The first early this morning, about 7:30, a prayer breakfast in Cocoa Beach. The mood this morning was one of hope. Instead of focusing on the failure of a year ago, people here want to focus on the future, and they want to turn the disaster of Challenger into a challenge for future safe travel, future space travel that is safe. Also today, as you mentioned, the 73 seconds of silence here at the Cape where the flag was lowered to half-mast. The countdown clock ticked away, the 73 seconds, the flag was lowered, and then after that, frankly, NASA went back to work. This has been a day at NASA that I would describe as thoughtful, one when managers and employees, rank and file alike, want to continue on their pursuit of space, but at the same time have to pause to remember the 7 dear friends they lost a year ago.
Well, Deborah, with that in mind, what about the NASA employees? How are they viewing the overall significance, this being now the first anniversary of the Challenger disaster?
The people that I spoke with today, Jim, felt that this was a turning point, that they had really been through a very, very difficult year. And now that the first anniversary was here and everyone pauses to remember the tragedy of a year ago, that they're going to turn this into a positive experience. This is now going to be an incentive to continue the pursuit of space and to move forward with the Space Shuttle program.
Deborah, thank you. Deborah Gianolis live tonight from the Kennedy Space Center. By the way, President Reagan at about 3 o'clock this afternoon by videotape extended his best wishes to the employees of the Space Center and also remembered the disaster a year ago today. Barry?
The accident, of course, was devastating to the families of the crew members, but there is another group which was also affected just as much, the astronauts. But Florida News Network reporter Scott Peelan recently found out the astronauts want Americans to put their grief behind them and get back into space as quickly and safely as possible.
Forgetting the bad and remembering the good. We humans are very good at that. And nowhere has there been more bad to forget in the last year than at NASA. Both here at the Johnson Space Center in Houston and at the Cape, the astronauts admit Challenger's destruction brutalized their morale.
Yeah, it did take a hit. I think everybody was down. I mean, we knew that. I'd known all the people on that crew, at least the astronauts, for seven years. I mean, these are good friends there.
But Dr. Bill Fisher is sure those good friends he lost would not want their deaths to stop the space program.
I see that explosion and I say, let's not let that happen again. Let's fix our problems and let's press on.
Fisher, who, by the way, is originally from Winter Park, is confident Floridians and all Americans want to press on with manned space travel. During a rare interview, during a tour of the shuttle trainer, Fisher told us nearly all of the cards and letters he's received from the public want manned space travel to go on. Bill Fisher says he also gets a lot of support to continue flying from his family. Not surprising, since his wife, Anna, is a veteran astronaut. In fact, their little girl, Kristen, is the first child parented by space travelers. Long ago, they told Kristen about the dangers of being an astronaut.
She was watching live when the Challenger exploded, And I don't know, we've talked about it enough that I think the situation may become diffused. But there's no sense hiding the fact that in any endeavor like this, there's always going to be some risk.
Fisher says NASA's critics sometimes forget there is a risk in just about everything in life, but the astronauts aren't letting these risks bother them. How is the morale around the program completely?
Oh, the closer we get to flying, the better and better it is.
Flying is next set for February 18th, 1988, and for the first time in shuttle history, the astronauts will have a lot more say-so on the mechanics, escape system, and construction of the shuttle.
My own feeling in this matter is that we probably should have had more say than we had in the past. I think that was a consensus in our office, and I think that's already been rectified.
This is one of the men who had a lot to do with the rectifying, Captain Richard Houck. He'll be the first commander of the shuttle when it flies again next winter. But he's first to admit, chances of meeting that deadline are not nearly as important as having a mission that doesn't fail.
Number one, if that were to happen, I really think that might be the end of the manned space program.
Houck made that comment during a recent crew news conference. Afterwards, he told us he seldom dwells on last January's disaster, but he does expect his mind to flash back on launch day.
Well, I'm sure that when the main engine's light off and the solid rockets ignite, there'll be a flash of thought back to January 28th, 1986. And I imagine that 73 seconds into the flight, I'll briefly reflect on that, but we'll get back to the business at hand and watching our instruments as we go upward and looking out the window, maybe stealing a glance at the blue turning to black, and we'll be back. We'll be in business again.
At the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Scott Peterlin, Florida News Network.
Former astronauts are also expressing confidence tonight that the problems with the shuttle program will be solved and that the vehicles will be back flying high next year. I recently spoke to Apollo astronaut Al Worden, who was on a moon flight mission. He, too, is optimistic, not only about the shuttle, but about America's space program in general.
Absolutely. I think there's no question about it. I hate to see a tragedy occur. I think everybody does. And that one was particularly catastrophic and terrible thing. But out of that comes a new program, a new commitment, equipment that is going to give everybody a much higher level of confidence, new management, new objectives, new goals. And I think I think it's only up from here on. I really do. Jim, I think it's been a year of almost total reevaluation and reshuffling, if you will, of not only programs and administrative or management procedures, but also of management itself. And I think that's inevitable when you have that kind of a tragedy, that everything gets looked at, all the rocks get turned over. We now have a new management team in NASA. There's a totally new management philosophy in NASA.
Well, Colonel, with regard to the shuttle disaster, it seems as though the NASA Space Administration was walking a thin edge. When you went on your Apollo 15 mission with your two fellow astronauts, did you feel any apprehension? Did you think that NASA was walking on a thin edge then?
Absolutely not. It was a totally different program when we flew in Apollo. We understood the risk that we were assuming. But we had a very confident, very comfortable feeling about the way the program was managed, the way the equipment was built, the way it had been tested, all the flight controllers, everybody was working towards a common goal, and we really had the confidence that everybody was trying to get the job done rather than protect their own job, which I think is a change in the shuttle program now.
And these thoughts about civilians in space?
I have absolutely no feelings about, when you say no civilians among them, I have to be very honest with you. I have to be very honest with you, Jim. There are no civilians in the astronaut program. Once a person signs up for the program, they lose their civilian
status.
And then I think you have to carry that one step further, and you say, Krista McAuliffe, is she a civilian? She was a civilian until the day she signed the papers going into the program to make that one flight. And then she ceased to be a civilian. We are all Americans, all doing a job, all very patriotic, I assume, and we all risk what we have to risk to see that that job gets done. And as far as I'm concerned, that takes the whole thing out of the context of civilian or otherwise.
We will continue our special edition of Action 5 News with a look at two companies and their ties to the space program.
Plus, contributions the space program has made in the medical field. From HealthWise reporter Brian Jenkins. The Challenger tragedy 1 year later, with a look at two local companies and their ties to the Space Coast.
Pratt & Whitney, one of Palm Beach County's largest employers, has been part of the space program since the beginning. However, it has not played a role in any of the manned space flights. Tonight, Tom Castanotis tells us the company is trying to change that by becoming a contributor to both the Shuttle and future space flights.
Here in the deserted area that Pratt & Whitney uses for testing equipment, these machines are being prepared to be used once again. The last time anything moved here was 1971, when Pratt & Whitney was developing engine components for what was a new space venture, the Shuttle. But NASA chose another contractor for the work, and Pratt & Whitney was shut out of the Shuttle program. Now, 16 years later, the company has another chance at the Shuttle through this piece of equipment. It's a turbo pump, and NASA wants a new one.
The Space Shuttle main engine alternate turbopump development program is to make turbopumps that will be more durable for the Space Shuttle main engine. These pumps will be interchangeable with the ones that are now flying.
Pratt & Whitney's strongest tie to the space program is this engine. Designed, developed, and built at the company's Palm Beach County plant, the engine is used on unmanned flights. Its power propels the rocket into its upper orbit. As the space program moves into the next century, Pratt & Whitney is hoping to go along on the ride. The company now is competing with two other firms to build the engines for the planes that are expected to go from Washington to Tokyo in 2 hours.
The aerospace plane does have the versatility of providing a cruise capability. It can fly at hypersonic speeds, 8,000 to 10,000 miles per hour to any point in the world instead of going into orbit.
The first flight is scheduled for 1993. Tom Castanotis, Action 5 News.
One local company got into the space program because of the Challenger disaster. It's the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Foundation in St. Lucie County. You may recall its robot sub was instrumental in recovering Challenger debris. Live with Newsnet 5 now is reporter Mark Kaler. Mark?
Well, Jim, Harbor Branch submersibles are used to make detailed studies of the ocean bottom. But 1 year ago today, the institution received a call from NASA. Officials there were looking for answers, and they knew the shuttle debris would provide at least a few answers. Nonetheless, the call came at a bad time for Harbor Branch. Winter is a time for maintenance, and these unique submersibles are in dozens of pieces. They were in much the same shape 1 year ago today, and when the call came from NASA, technicians scrambled to put at least one submersible back together. There were other problems, too.
We're operating at a time of the year when the weather in the Gulf Stream can be pretty bad. When you have the big northern fronts come down, the seas can be 10, 12 feet, and they were a couple times.
The submersibles normally are used to photograph plant life and extract small samples from the ocean bottom. But this mission would be far different. The debris eventually recovered came in a variety of shapes and sizes. It was found in a 600 square mile area about 20 miles offshore. No one knew where it was concentrated.
We didn't want to put a manned submersible down there, not knowing the size of the wreckage down there, whether there were possible hazards for us for a manned vehicle to become entangled in.
So Navy ships first scanned the area with sonar. Then the submersibles entered the target sites and photographed the debris.
Some of it was old ancient shorelines, some was old shipwrecks, some was old airplane wreckage, and some of it was Space Shuttle Challenger debris. And we stayed there until we found the critical piece on the solid rocket booster on the right side that indicated, yes, they had a burn throw.
Some of that critical evidence turned up the very first day, but before the recovery mission was over, 2.5 months had passed and some 25 scientists had taken part. For Cook and Askew, the first days were somber, but time brought enthusiasm.
And by us being there and locating these various pieces would hopefully eventually help correct the problem.
Harbor Branch submersibles are rated at about 3,000 feet. That means they can go that far without power from the ship. Now, without those subs, they would have had to use smaller, tethered, unmanned ships to go down, and probably they are more susceptible to the high waves. So in all probability, it would have taken much longer to get the debris recovered. Jim?
Mark Kaler reporting live tonight. NASA presented Harbor Branch with a special award for its efforts in recovering the shuttle debris. Well, down through the years, the shuttle program has helped to bring about some scientific advances to the science of oceanography.
It has also brought about many major advancements in the medical field. Our HealthWise reporter Brian Jenkins continues our coverage of the Challenger disaster 1 year later.
When the Space Shuttle Discovery lifted off back in August of 1984, the hopes of the medical world went up with it. We all knew about the much talked about multi-million-dollar satellites involved in the mission, but little was said about the flight's other project, to manufacture a much-needed hormone called erythropoietin, crucial to the health of anemics and kidney patients.
The overall benefit would be that in an individual patient they wouldn't require transfusion therapy, therefore avoiding the infectious problems that go along with transfusions, such as hepatitis, the problems with iron overload in their system with an enlarging spleen and liver problems.
Several drug manufacturers tried to get in on the erythropoietin project, and it isn't the only collaborative effort between NASA and the medical world that's attracted them.
One of the drugs that we used to treat Hodgkin's disease with was originally developed by NASA as part of a solid rocket fuel. And it's a very effective drug.
In addition, research on the effects of weightlessness on astronauts has helped doctors tremendously in understanding the development of osteoporosis in women. The American Heart Association is even taking its research on heart disease to NASA in hopes that new treatments may be developed with the help of space research. Whatever answers may lie in space, NASA researchers and doctors agree that we'll have at least some of them within the next few years. Brian Jenkins, Action 5 News.
And of course, who can forget the effects of the space program on our eating habits? There's tang, microwaves, and microwave dishes and food.
Watching the explosion from my office at work, I was more or less catatonic for the rest of the day. Was literally crying about it that night. My wife had suggested that I write a song. I've written some songs in the past, and she suggested that might be a good way to get it out.
Box tanking secured.
Box tanking secured.
T-minus 27 seconds and counting. All recorders and oscillographs to fast. Vernier start.
Go.
A little piece of America rode a rocket to the sky, left behind a troubled world to search for reasons why. Courage as they chased our dream to the heavens through the sky. They gently kissed the face of God with no time to say goodbye. And the spirit of the Challenger lives on. The dream that sent her to the sky is a part of everyone. The courage they have shown us, the price that they have paid. The spirit of the Challenger lives on with us today. A teacher from among us came to share with us her dream, riding through the heavens, all a part of one great team. The lesson she taught us is still burning in our minds. We should treasure every day, living one day at a time. And the spirit of the Challenger lives on. The dream that sent her to the sky is part of everyone. The courage they have shown us, the price that they have paid. The spirit of the Challenger lives on with us today. Seven souls went home to heaven in the twinkling of an eye. We searched to find the reason why the best of us must die. Their courage and valor disappeared into the sky, but our dreams that travel with them, they must never ever die. And the spirit of the Challenger lives on. The dream that sent her to the sky is part of everyone. The courage they have shown us, the price that they have paid. The spirit of the Challenger lives on with us today. The Challenger lives on. The dream that sent her to the sky is part of everyone. The courage they have shown us, the price that they have paid. The spirit of the Challenger lives on with us today.
The 87 Lincolns are here.
Suffered by the American space program. Good evening, I'm Ann Bishop. It's getting a little bit dark here now, but this day has been bright, punctuated with loving services and memorials to the 7 crew members of the Challenger who lost their lives. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Peggy Lewis.
Dawn at the Kennedy Space Center. A similar sunrise gave hope for a Challenger mission. Now, a year later, an entire community remembers the tragedy and the 7 who lost their lives. They prayed.
Thank you for this occasion, which we honor the memory of brave men and women.
And shed tears and heard words of comfort.
Their dreams is still alive. Alive.
They gently kiss the face of God with no time.
Good evening, I'm Barry Judge at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where 75% of the operations are dedicated to returning the space shuttle to flight status by February 1988.
And I'm Jim Sackett at the Kennedy Space Center. Since the Challenger disaster, it has been a year of reflection, revamping, and reorganization for America's hard-hit space program. A year of regrouping.
We begin our broadcast tonight with the troubled days leading up to the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger 1 year ago. Bob Upsall of the Florida News Network has the story from Cape Canaveral.
And looking back, it seems as if everything was trying to keep the Challenger on the ground. Big things like the weather, which forced 3 delays, and even little things like a handle that refused to come off the crew entrance door until it was too late to launch. That was January 27th. A disappointed crew crawled back out of the Challenger for a final 24-hour delay. It would be 1 delay too few. Early on the morning of the 28th, smiles were back on the faces of the astronauts as they ate a hot breakfast. But outside, it was cold, freezing cold. So cold, we would find out later that rubber seals in the booster joints, the O-rings, got stiff and didn't seal properly. But nobody knew that then, and the countdown continued. The astronauts' smiles had turned to grins by the time they headed out to the launch pad, cheered on by their co-workers at Kennedy Space Center. But it looked as if the weather might force another delay. There were concerns about the cold. No shuttle had ever been launched in temperatures that low. But after 2 hours on hold, the countdown clock was restarted. And at 11:38 that morning,
8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
But right at that point, nobody saw the puff of smoke that blew from a joint in the right-hand booster. It signaled disaster.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Everything seemed fine, but then, 59 seconds into the flight, a small flame started shooting from the side of the booster where that puff of smoke had been. It took 13 seconds for the flame to blowtorch its way into the side of the external fuel tank. But for nearly 1 minute after the disaster, Krista McCullough's parents and all the other spectators didn't know what to think until Launch Control announced,
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Pieces of the Challenger fell for nearly an hour, splashing into the Atlantic 10 miles from the launch site. Search teams were on the way, but there would be no rescue.
On the anniversary of the Challenger disaster, January 28th, all work at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama stops for 73 seconds. The length of time Challenger was in the air before it exploded, killing 7 astronauts. The rest of the time is spent pushing the space program into the future.
And so if we're going into space, the shuttle is going to have to perform.
William Marshall's new responsibility is the shuttle's most dangerous elements, the propulsion system, the section of Challenger that failed.
We've all gotten another glimpse at the fact we're not perfect. It not only has awakened us, but it will cause us to be awakened for a long time.
NASA is working toward a February 18, 1988 launch. As of now, the Shuttle Projects Office at Marshall can support that date. Astronauts, out of training since the accident, and now part of management and review boards, are contributing to the redesign of the solid rocket booster. To prevent burning fuel from leaking again, engineers have eliminated a troublesome putty, bonded the insulation together, and developed a J-seal to achieve a tighter fit.
We've taken every contributing factor to that accident in this joint area and put in a design that would preclude that from happening in the future. We understand it much, much better than we did earlier, its operation, its performance, and its limits.
John Thomas, part of the NASA group which investigated the Challenger explosion, is manager of the solid rocket motor design team. He told me the next shuttle will be the safest built yet. 100 of these $500 high-strength bolts will reduce the potential danger of explosion around the engine nozzle joints where the gas is expelled.
Essentially 10 times better from a gapping standpoint.
Redesigning the solid rocket motor will cost an estimated $300 million. Testing the new motor for flight worthiness begins next summer at Morton Thiokol's Utah location. The company has a contract to build the motor. Meanwhile, other space projects are at various stages of safety-oriented development that will lead eventually to public debut. But most NASA officials agree it is the shuttle which is the key to success for America's space program. Jim Sackett has more on the new technology waiting for a ride into space.
Barry, technology is a driving force behind the space program in this country, but that technology is only as good as the people using it and developing it. Both failed last year high above Launch Complex 39 here at the Kennedy Space Center. That disaster involving the Challenger forced NASA to pull back and examine its philosophy of technology, a philosophy that's predicated on the fact that technology is a cure-all for all our problems.
Bring it forward slowly. Just kind of walk it up to you if you can. Okay.
From an idea to the cold of outer space, repairing a broken satellite using a mechanical arm for support, a backpack for maneuvering, man and machine, weightless and drifting, demonstrating the versatility of man as he uses his new technology, using it to push farther and farther into space. The space shuttle is a springboard. Many Americans, not all, have an abiding faith in the fact any problem can be solved using the right technology. While not shattered, that faith was severely rocked when the Challenger exploded.
That's another area that we've looked at pretty heavily. There obviously has to be a synergism, a compromise between the two areas. Obviously, the exploration of Mars, for example, or Jupiter or Saturn, as we've done before, has to be done by a robot.
As NASA continues regrouping, shooting for what is now apparently a rather optimistic February 1988 launch date to get the revamped program back off the ground, some of the people that I spoke with at a Florida Turnpike service plaza were pretty much in agreement. Despite the tragedy, they still support the space program.
Yes, definitely. Those are accidents that happened. That's it.
Definitely. Definitely, I feel there's a whole new world out there.
Well, my thoughts are I think we should continue on in the future for the younger generation.
I think that we need to investigate
further and further our knowledge into what is out there.
In a moment, how South Florida pays tribute to the Challenger 7.
1 year later. Put into the classroom. And movies such as Space Camp are helping to keep it alive.
We have main engine test.
Terry Parker has more now on student interest in space.
They're called Challengers, but students at Palm Beach County's Christa McAuliffe School attend classes at Congress Middle School. Like the replacement shuttle, the Christa McAuliffe School is under construction. That means the Challengers don't have much of an identity yet, but they all identify with the teacher who died in space and whose memorial they will inhabit.
You sort of think about the children of Christa McAuliffe and feel how they felt when they finally found out what happened.
Principals here at Christa McAuliffe are not holding a large memorial to mark the anniversary. They say overemphasizing the tragedy could be traumatic to small children. Instead, principals are emphasizing the Challenger crew's courage, especially McAuliffe's.
The fact that she was a teacher, I think, is certainly of significance to those of us in education, to children, to, as she said in her book, you know, you can really do anything.
They're ordering Challenger patches and jackets, looking forward instead of past. And that's fine with students such as Heather Ratliff.
I think it should be remembered that she was the first teacher up in space and it was her first voyage, but we shouldn't remember it as like she got killed, but she was the first one up in space.
One of the best ways to remember McAuliffe, students say, is naming Palm Beach County's newest and most beautiful school after her.
Because it will let people know that she was something special.
Today, youngsters at the Green Acres Day School remembered the shuttle crew. The students were silent for 73 seconds in memory of the Challenger flight. And in Lake Park today, a living memorial for astronauts killed while serving this country. 10 trees were planted, 1 for each member of the Challenger crew, and 3 for the astronauts killed 20 years ago aboard the Apollo 1 during a tragic launch pad fire.
Coming up next on Action 5 News, another challenge for NASA, surviving federal budget cuts. We'll talk with a member of the House Science and Technology Committee when Action 5 News continues. When you start thinking about putting America back into space?
Well, Barry, every time you start talking about budget cuts, you certainly get worried about the space program. But I don't believe that the president is looking to cutting the space program, particularly the shuttle program, or any money for the new orbiter. So I'm rather confident that we'll go ahead with the program like we should.
During this past hour, Congressman, we have, of course, been talking about the Challenger disaster a year ago. Your assessment in the intervening 12 months with regard to the shuttle program?
Well, I think we've done a lot of soul searching. I think that now the shuttle program and our space programs will be safer than ever. But I think we also have to recognize that whenever that shuttle leaves the ground or starts its launch, we're always taking a risk, no matter how many safety precautions we take. But that's man's destiny if he wants to explore these outer frontiers, and that's what we have to do. I feel we owe it to the 7 people who died on Challenger last January 28th that we go forward with our space program, because our future depends upon it, and so does our children's.
Congressman, let's go back to the money angle for just a moment. Do you think that tying the space program to the Pentagon, to our defense of the country, will safeguard it in terms of ensuring enough money will be available to put us back into space?
Well, certainly that should be a help, Barry, because they're going to have at least 1 or 2 orbiters ready most of the time to go up and make repairs on the DoD satellites. So that's going to help us in a great way, and it's also going to allow us to share back and forth between the Space Agency and the Department of Defense.
The next mission, Congressman, as you well know, has now been slated for February 18th, 1988. Still a lot of work to be done on the shuttle program. Are you optimistic that NASA may be able to meet that date, or are you looking for a delay?
Well, I think they're going to be able to meet it. First of all, you have to establish a schedule. If you don't establish a schedule, then you're going to continue to put fixes in the shuttle, and you'll never get off the ground. So I feel very good about it, and I think it'll probably be the safest shuttle flight we've ever had.
There's been a lot of attention today on the first anniversary of the disaster of the Challenger and its 7 crew members. What is Congress, what's Washington going to do to ensure that we never forget?
Well, I think that one thing is to continue our space program and to move on beyond the shuttle program well into our space station program and well into looking at manned lunar trips to Mars and further beyond to other galaxies. But I think the thing that we have to recognize are the various offshoots and the fringe benefits we receive as mankind from the space program. And I think Congress recognizes that and recognizes that we've advanced so far over the past 20 years that certainly there's no turning back.
Congressman, I know that you've been very active in trying to formulate or help come up with a name for the new shuttle that's going to be built. What is the status of that so far?
Well, NASA is working right now and coming up with their system on how to allow the elementary school children of the United States to name the next shuttle. The President agrees with this program. He likes it. He's interested in it. And also Dr. Fletcher, the administrator of NASA. So I'm quite hopeful that we'll get this thing moving in the next few months.
Thanks, Congressman, for braving the cold there in the nation's capital to join us tonight.
It's chilly. Thank you.
Speaking of weather, Art Horn will be taking a look back 1 year ago to the cold at the Cape.
And, of course, he will also be checking our own forecast in a moment.
To the heavens, through the sky, they gently kiss the face of God with no time to say goodbye, and the spirit of the Challenger.
We can also remember the icicles that we were shown hanging from the shuttle itself to indicate just how cold it was up there that January 28th last year.
As we were reminded, no launch had ever taken place in such cold weather, and it was the coldest weather of the winter. We'll talk about the temperatures. 69 presently, or 68 now, I should say. Last hour, just down a degree. 45% humidity of the barometer rising a little bit, and the wind diminishing out of the northwest. Well, just for your numbers for today, 69 today, 10 degrees warmer than yesterday. 42 the low this morning, 33 up at Vero Beach and 37 at Clewiston. So not too bad. No rainfall, and the surf temperature is 68 degrees. Here is the map of the southeast, and this is what was going on last year, 1 year ago today. We had a big Arctic high pressure area funneling cold air down into the state, and these were the morning low temperatures. 25 at the Cape, 26 at Orlando, 22 at Daytona, at Gainesville 19, and 17 at Jacksonville. We were down to 31 here and 25 at Vero. It was a very cold morning, so that caused the problems with the O-rings. Another concern was the jet stream. We had a powerful jet stream diving from the north and colliding with the subtropical jet stream, which was moving over us, and that caused strong wind shears. We look at a picture of the shuttle trail, and you can see this extreme bend in here. That was caused by very powerful winds blowing from the west across the shuttle. Future missions may also incur this very severe turbulence. That's something to think about for the future. Here's the national map for right now. We're talking about cool but not cold weather coming up for tonight. And then tomorrow, as the high pressure area gets off to our east, warmer conditions moving in. Here's the way it looks for tonight. Clear, not as cold. Temperatures 44 to 52 for lows and northwest winds of 4 to 8. For tomorrow, sunny and warmer, 70 to 75. I like that much better. Northeast winds 8 to 16. And for boaters, northeast 7 to 12 knots tomorrow, 2 to 3 foot seas. Your high tides at 7:54 in the morning. There's your sunrise and sunset. In a word, comfortable. Much better.
Thanks, Art.
Okay, Jim.
In a moment, Pat Murphy will check the progress of a free agent.
A special tribute to the Challenger crew and to all the people who are keeping their spirit alive. In a moment.
The Challenger lives on with us today. The Challenger lives on. The dream that sent her to the sky is part of every
Challenger 1 year later. Thank you for being with us.
We close our broadcast tonight with a look back and a look into the future, put together by our editor, D. Watt. It's a special tribute to the Challenger 7 and to all the men and women who are determined to put America back into space.
Man tries many things, and we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect.
The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much.
searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
We must never, as people in our daily lives or as a nation, stop exploring, stop hoping, stop discovering. We must press on.
Witness News at 11. South Florida's #1 late news with Ann Bishop, Dwight Lauderdale, meteorologist Don Noe, Jerry Azar, and the Channel 10 Eyewitness News team.
1 year ago today, our nation stunned by tragedy in space. The Shuttle Challenger exploding right after takeoff, taking with it the lives of 7 astronauts, the hopes and dreams of millions. Good evening, Ann is on assignment. Michelle Gillen is joining us. The shock has faded, but the memories endure. Across our country, around our community, people pausing to remember the shuttle catastrophe.
The most moving tribute today at Cape Canaveral. We have team coverage on all the observances, beginning with Eyewitness News reporter Peggy Lewis via NewsSat 10, live from the Space Center. Peggy?
Michelle and Dwight, it's been a very somber day here at the Kennedy Space Center as people remember the Challenger explosion. As you know, it's been a very difficult year for the people here who are tied very closely to the space program. It's been a year of layoffs, 2,500 people without work, but today they took time to remember.
Dawn at the Kennedy Space Center. A similar sunrise gave hope for a Challenger mission. Now, a year later, an entire community remembers the tragedy and the 7 who lost their lives. They prayed.
Thank you for this occasion, which we honor the memory of brave men and women.
And shed tears and heard words of comfort.
Their dreams is still alive, alive to give each of us the opportunity to face new challenges and succeed.
They placed wreaths on plaques bearing the Challenger crew's names and put a flag at half-staff. And at the Kennedy Space Center, 13,000 NASA employees stopped working at 11:38 and were silent for 73 seconds, the time it took for the Shuttle Challenger to change the space program forever. 40 miles away at an elementary school named after teacher and payload specialist Krista McAuliffe, the entire school gathered to pay tribute to 7 heroes.
We proudly light this candle in memory of Ellison Onizuka, Gregory B. Jarvis, Vaughn McNair, Judith Resnick, Dick Scobie, Michael J. Smith, Krista McAuliffe.
On this first anniversary, those whose lives are tied so closely to the space program here on the Space Coast remember not only the tragedy, but look forward to the future with hope.
We've got a lot more to accomplish in the years to come. And we all look forward to.
And we didn't want to let you go, but we'll carry you
And of course, everyone here is hoping that NASA will meet its projection of having the launch of the Discovery, a successful launch, February 18, 1988. Dwight, Michelle?
Peggy, thank you for that live update. Eyewitness News reporter Peggy Lewis, live from Cape Canaveral.
Of course, the Challenger astronauts were also remembered at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Employees here observing 73 seconds of silence, the same length of time the shuttle was in the air before it exploded. Flags were at the center lowered at half-mast during the tribute. Most workers say last year's tragedy has only strengthened their resolve to carry on. And a similar scene in the nation's capital. Flags outside NASA headquarters also lowered in memory of the astronauts. Officials at the Space Center say they are rebounding from the Challenger catastrophe, working on plans to launch that other shuttle next year.
An emotional day for the father of astronaut Gregory Jarvis. He was joined by dozens of people at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Orlando laying a wreath in honor of his son. Greg Jarvis was a satellite engineer on the mission. His wife spent the day alone in quiet reflection. In Concord, New Hampshire, a special tribute to astronaut Krista McAuliffe. A portrait of the school teacher presented to the governor today. We're told it will be placed in the state capitol as a special honor to a woman who touched all our lives. In our community, one of McAuliffe's relatives remembering last year's disaster, Marcia Murphy, a teacher at Lauderhill Manor Elementary School, still haunted by the catastrophe that killed her cousin. Her words 1 year after the tragedy.
Well, a year ago today, she was still alive. You know, a year ago today, we were still excited. And when she was walking out and waving to everyone, and the other astronauts also, I thought, did they ever know that 2 hours from now they would be dead? And I really became overcome thinking about that.
Murphy says she is still angry about the explosion, convinced the legacy the astronauts left was not worth their lives.
On the other hand, Vice President George Bush talked today of the lessons, be they very painful, learned from this disaster. Meeting with relatives of the victims, Mr. Bush pledged to raise money for space learning centers around the country. Family and friends of the late astronaut gathered in the nation's capital for those memorial services. Well, it was a day for all of us to look back at a group of men and women who gave us their all. What really hurts, though, is that it seems their mission was ill-fated from the start, as Ann Bishop found out at the Cape.
It was almost as if this Challenger flight was never to be. There were 6 delays, and of course the morning of the launch, it was the coldest it had ever been for a liftoff. There were icicles all over everything. But nevertheless, Challenger went up into space.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission.
The launch appeared picture perfect despite the icy temperature, a stinging cold that had stiffened O-rings, rubber seals designed to join the boosters together. Nobody saw the puff of smoke that blew from a joint in the right rocket booster. Everything appeared routine. But 59 seconds after liftoff, from that same joint, a small flame shooting upward, and 13 seconds later, the flame had burned into the external fuel tank, touching off an inferno that blew the flight apart, oddly turning a tragedy into a spectacular display of spraying fireworks.
Obviously a major malfunction.
It's a scene none of us will ever forget, but one that confused the spectators who couldn't understand what had happened until the ominous word came from launch control.
Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics office that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
Search crews were launched before the debris had finished falling into the ocean, but their mission would fail as well.
These searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
This crew of 7 was lost. 4 of them space veterans, 46-year-old mission commander Dick Scobie, 36-year-old Judith Resnick, America's second woman in space, 39-year-old mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, and 35-year-old Ronald McNair. The other 3 had never flown a space shuttle before. 40-year-old mission pilot Michael Smith, 41-year-old mission specialist Greg Jarvis, and 37-year-old teacher Krista McAuliffe.
Oh, I am so excited to be here.
They all left for this mission with high hopes in their hearts, and each would be saddened to know their flight slowed the country's space program. But that delay has brought us new technology, more safety, more astronaut involvement in the plans for the next flight, set for February in 1988. The commander will be Captain Richard Houck, who says the schedule date is not nearly as important as having a successful flight and the resumption of a successful space program.
I'm sure that when the main engines light off and the solid rockets ignite, there'll be a flash of thought back to January 28th, 1986. We'll get back to the business at hand and watching our instruments as we go upward and looking out the window, maybe stealing a glance of the blue turning to black, and we'll be back. We'll be in business again.
There is now hope and optimism. The space program, indeed the entire world, is looking forward to February of 1988. I'm Ann Bishop for Eyewitness News at Cape Canaveral on the Night Beat.
President Reagan marking this anniversary by talking to NASA workers via satellite. He assured them the administration is committed to rebuilding the shuttle program and commended space industry workers for their dedication and drive to resume America's quest for space exploration. Former astronaut, now Senator John Glenn, says he's pleased with the progress made by NASA 1 year after the explosion. Glenn was the first American to circle the Earth in a space capsule. He agrees we should carry on the work left undone by the Challenger crew. But Glenn criticizes President Reagan for not mentioning the Challenger anniversary in his State of the Union speech last
night. Of the hostages in the Middle East, there is a continuing U.S. military presence in the Mediterranean. We have no idea, at least looking at it on the surface, what the administration intends it to be doing. But as ABC's John McCarthy reports from Washington tonight, the administration does want people to believe there could be action if the hostages in Lebanon are harmed.
Nearly all the pieces have now been laid into place to strike and strike quickly should any American hostage be killed in Lebanon. U.S. sources tell ABC News that the military, intelligence, and public relations groundwork has all been prepared. Military. 2 aircraft carriers, the Kennedy and Nimitz, continue to maneuver off the coast of Lebanon. Though the Kennedy is scheduled to return home in early March, another carrier, the Kitty Hawk, now in the Indian Ocean, will be brought through the Suez Canal before then to make sure there are always at least 2 carriers at ready, with a combined strike force of some 170 aircraft. More important, Pentagon sources say the Joint Chiefs of Staff have pulled together what one source describes as the most complete list of targets in Lebanon ever compiled by the U.S. Intelligence. From the terrorists who survived the Rome and Vienna airport attacks in 1985, the Karachi hijacking in 1986, and half a dozen other news sources, the intelligence community has gained a wealth of new information about the mafia-style families of Lebanon who are believed to be holding American hostages and promoting terrorism outside of Lebanon. Said one source, we now know who they are, where they live, who they associate with, and where they go when the heat is on. A year ago, the U.S. knew almost none of this. Public relations. Secretary Shultz laid into place an important part of the U.S. public rationalization last weekend when he argued that the people of Lebanon are responsible for what happens there, even though the country is in a state of anarchy.
The people of Beirut have a responsibility for their own community, and they're not exercising it.
So the way has now been cleared for retaliation if 1 or more U.S. hostages are killed. Sources say
by the Soviet. CNN's Jim Clancy reports from Rome on the implications of the U.S. move.
The U.S. offer to put American naval power to work in the Persian Gulf may involve more than a justified concern about the flow of oil to the West. European analysts say the Reagan administration's bid to provide naval escorts to tankers in the Gulf is designed to mend relations with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states, relations hurt by the Iran arms deal.
It's also the kind of action which will be perceived in the West as a new example of resolve and of determination on the part of the administration, which used to be one of its strong points over 6 years and was shattered rather badly over the last 3 or 4 months.
Iran and Iraq sharply escalated attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf last month. Since 1984, more than 300 vessels have been hit and at least 100 seamen killed. The main targets of Iran's gunners have been tankers belonging to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, countries that side with Iraq in the war. The strategic importance of the Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz is clear. 1/5 of the oil consumed by the free world is shipped through these waters. The U.S. has consistently said it would defend international shipping rights in the Gulf.
Discussions continue with the Gulf states, including Kuwait, on the threat posed by Iranian attacks on neutral shipping. These talks are consistent with our pledge to maintain the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz and the great importance we attach to freedom of navigation in international waters.
While Kuwait turned down the offer of American naval escorts, the State Department confirms other options are being discussed with Gulf states. The administration's willingness to take a more direct role in the region could help restore America's standing among moderate Arab nations and send a message to Tehran that the U.S. can still influence events in the Gulf. Jim Clancy, CNN.
They use the radioactive decay of plutonium to produce electricity.